Hi ladies, this week you're going to read chapter 14, 15, and 16 from the textbook, and you have an outline due for your research paper. Again, the research paper needs to be about an important woman in the history of the church, and you're going to make an argument that she is important based on her contributions. And so this week you have to do an outline of that paper. The outline should be fairly detailed, but it only needs to be a keyword outline, so you don't need to list sentences, but it should be detailed about what will be said in your paper. And remember, if there's a capital A, there has to be a capital B. If there's a 1, there has to be a 2. If there's a Roman numeral 1, there has to be a Roman numeral 2. And there's a couple of examples of outlines that are posted on this week's module. So just a little bit about the reading that you're going to do this week. First of all, the first chapter will talk about the era that's known as Christendom. And this is basically the era when almost everyone was Christian. And prior to this, we talked before about barbarian groups trying to attack different parts of the Roman Empire. And so when that happened, when the barbarians came into the Roman Empire, they would usually try to convert the people. But in the era of Christendom, you see Christians going out to groups of people like that and converting them as they conquer them. There are some outsiders at this time in Christendom. One of those groups are the Jewish people. They're the one group that kind of remained in the area. And there was some discrimination against the Jewish people. When they lived there, they had to live in a certain part of town. They had to wear something on their clothing that indicated they were Jewish. They were sometimes forced to attend religious rituals. The popes did condemn this. They didn't approve of forced baptisms or making them participate in the Catholic faith. But at the same time, the Jewish people were definitely discriminated. One of the sources of this discrimination was because there was a rule that Christians could not loan people money, and so that left that job for Jewish people. And so Jewish people became kind of seen as people that were making a profit off other people, and there's a lot of even stereotypes today that still continue because of that. Another group that was kind of on the outskirts of Catholicism was Islam. And so I want to mention here the Crusades. This was a series of battles that happened where the Islamic people had taken over the Middle East, and they had started to kind of march toward the West and try to conquer people and convert them to Islam. And one of the big issues that happened as a result of this is that they kind of closed off a passage to the Holy Land. And the Christians, of course, felt like they owned part of the Holy Land, and they wanted free access to it. And so under the kind of call of Pope Urban II, who called for the Crusades, a bunch of crusaders went to the eastern, the Middle East where Jerusalem was, and they engaged in these different battles. The first crusade was the only crusade that was actually successful, where they did take back the Promised Land or the the Holy Land, if you will. But every crusade after that was less and less successful, and it became more and more about greed and more about personal glory rather than taking back the Holy Land. So the Crusades did begin with a good intention. However, that was certainly not the only way that they could have arrived at that goal of getting access to the Holy Land. And a lot of people were killed, a lot of churches were looted, a lot of land was destroyed as a result. In this era of Christendom, we also see kind of the Pope at the height of his power. Prior to this, the Pope was kind of subject to the king, and during this time, the king and any emperors, they were subject to the moral code, at least, of the Catholic Church. One of those popes that you'll read about is Innocent III. He was the youngest person to be the Pope. You'll read about some of the ways that he kind of controlled the emperor. You'll also read about Pope Boniface and see that there were actually limitations to this as well, and read about some of the issues that pope had. A big thing has been in some of these videos and continues to be heresies. Again, heresies are false teachings and their leaders are called heretics. And so the church continued to try to weed out any heresies. And so there were some religious orders that developed at this time. One of those orders was the Franciscan order. One is the Dominicans. One were the Begans. I'm going to talk about those three. The Franciscans and the Dominicans were both friars They were mendicant, which meant that they left the monasteries, they left their houses of worship, and they went out into the streets and they found the poor people and they ministered to those people. One of my absolute favorite saints is St. Francis of Assisi. He basically was born in a very wealthy family. He felt called to build the church both literally and figuratively. When he did build an actual church using his family money, his father took him to court. And according to legend, in the courtroom, Francis of Assisi got so angry that he stripped down naked and he said, "You can have everything you ever gave me." And he walked out of the courthouse and he lived as in absolute poverty, reaching out to the poor people. Later, this order was kind of institutionalized. It fit more in line with what a lot of orders were doing. But for a while under Francis, they really did practice this real absolute poverty. The Dominicans were also, mendicant friars, also left their monastery to go serve the people. And their leader was Dominic de Guzman. Another thing that's important at this time were the sacraments. There are 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church. There are 3 that are called the sacraments of initiation. They're baptism, Eucharist, and confirmation. There are 2 that are sacraments of healing, which are reconciliation and holy orders. And there are 2 that are sacraments of vocation, which are marriage and, the last one I said holy orders. The sacraments of healing are actually reconciliation and anointing of the sick. The sacraments of vocation are holy orders and marriage. And so there's 7 sacraments in total. So along comes St. Thomas Aquinas, which is about, one of the chapters is all about him. He's one of the greatest theologians of all time. And St. Thomas Aquinas wanted to be a Dominican friar. His family wanted him to be a Benedictine monk. So they basically kidnapped him and put him in a tower in their house, and they kept him there, trying to convince him to become a Benedictine. Eventually, he escaped and did become a Dominican friar. And he's important, and the era that he was part of is called scholasticism. He certainly wasn't the only scholastic scholar, but he's the most influential. And basically, scholasticism tries to kind of wed reason and logic with faith. And so prior to that, people saw these as 2 separate things. And he's using logic and reason as a way to argue and prove God and faith. And so he wrote something very famous called the Summa Theologia. And in the Summa, he uses a special kind of argument, basically that is an article. And he uses a lot of inductive reasoning, like you might have used in a geometry class. A lot of if this is true, then this is true kind of statements. And he did a lot for the Catholic Church. Another development during scholasticism was called nominalism. Most people associate William of Ockham with this nominalism. And this is kind of an individualistic look at things. He basically says that everything deals with the individual and there's no universal kind of moral codes or anything like that. And I think we can still see influence from nominalism today. Another big thing that happened was the Black Death, which was the bubonic plague, and this killed 1/3 of all the people in Europe. Everyone in Europe knew someone who died of the Black Plague, and I think their grief and their expression of that grief is what led to the Renaissance, or at least the artistic Renaissance. A couple of people that were mentioned in the chapter that you'll read about are John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, and these are 2 people that really questioned the Pope and the authority of the Pope. Jan Hus was burned at the stake at the Council of Constance. Things didn't go great for them when they questioned the Pope, but that kind of is the, foreshadowing of the eventual Protestant Reformation that you'll read about later. Also, kind of to balance scholasticism, there were definitely other people who were what you call mystics. And the mystics said that, faith all had to deal with emotion and our experience of God and nothing to do with intellect. And so the mystics all had these kind of out-of-body, really mystical, unexplained sort of experiences with Jesus. They had visions. They sometimes were in catatonic states. They wrote about all of these things that they experienced and saw during these visions. 2 of the people that were mystics were St. Catherine of Siena and Julian of Norwich. Catherine of Siena was very important because she wrote during what's known as the Papal Schism. In the Papal Schism, there were French popes who moved the papacy to Avignon, France. And here they led the church. There were 7 popes in a row that led the church from France. And most people in the world, including Catherine of Siena, really felt like the church should be led from Rome. And so she wrote many letters to the Pope and had an audience with the Pope, eventually convincing a French Pope to move back the papacy to Rome. And she died actually before he moved, so she didn't even know in her life that her words impacted him that much. Another is Julian of Norwich, and Julian of Norwich lived in a little cell. She was basically a hermit. People came to visit her, and she wrote a book all about 20 years of these showings or these mystical experiences with Jesus. So enjoy the reading this week. Make sure you do the outlines. Next week, you're going to take a midterm exam, and then the week after that is your spring break. So I will not be doing a video next week or the week after. So again, let me know if you have any questions, and good luck on the exam, and enjoy your spring break. It won't feel like spring. It'll probably still be snowing, but enjoy it anyway.